Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Emily Schumann.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Beth Leleck. In 2008, Beth was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She was determined to maintain her mobility while living with the disease. Colorado, where Beth lives, is home to 58 mountains taller than 14,000 feet in height, known to the locals as 14ers. In 14 summers, Beth conquered all of Colorado's 14ers and raised more than $100,000 to fund multiple sclerosis research. Well, hi, Beth. Thanks so much for being our guest today. We're honored to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
I just want to start with, what can you share about your disability and how that impacts your daily life?
Sure. I've been living with multiple sclerosis since 2008. The symptoms that initially led to my diagnosis were loss of hearing in one ear. I was experiencing vertigo and I was losing feeling in my feet. It took a bit of time to, visiting different doctors before ultimately I had an MRI, and that led to my multiple sclerosis diagnosis. And initially, those symptoms, they were able to treat with steroids and kind of help bring those symptoms kind of back down. So for anyone not familiar with MS, it's a disease that attacks the brain and the central nervous system, interrupts the flow of information between the brain and the rest of the body. And so symptoms can really vary from one person to the next, from anything from vision challenges to hearing challenges to loss of feeling in the extremities and a whole host of other potential symptoms. For me personally, it was the hearing loss, vertigo, and kind of loss of feeling. And I have what's classified as relapsing remitting MS, which means I can have an attack and symptoms really flare up. And then when the attack kind of subsides, a lot of the symptoms tend to go away. However, I have learned over time that even if I'm not in a necessarily MS flare up, there are a lot of things in my day-to-day life that can impact those symptoms and bring them to the surface, basically kind of exacerbating like the damage that's already been done. And so some of the things that I encounter on an ongoing basis have heat sensitivity. And so I found that if I'm outdoors, especially in the high heat of summer, I can start to lose feeling in my feet when I get overheated. That's one that over time, it was certainly scary the first time I ran into that symptom, which happened when I was riding a bike and I put my foot down on the pavement and couldn't feel the road. But I've kind of learned how to manage it, with trying different ways to kind of help myself stay cool. And then the other one that I also encounter on an ongoing basis is extreme fatigue. That's one that I can also have more of an impact, like even on my work, that sometimes I've needed to take breaks or take naps during the day if I start to have a lot of challenges with fatigue.
And what in your life are you most proud of? And what are you most passionate about?
I hit a very exciting personal accomplishment this year, which was I completed climbing all 58 of Colorado's 14ers. Anyone unfamiliar with 14er? That's any mountain that's about 14,000 feet or taller. I've been hiking them over the course of the last 13 years and hiked my 58 at the end of June of this year, which was pretty exciting.
Wow, that's incredible. I didn't realize we had 58 14ers here. I knew we had a lot in Colorado, but I didn't realize it was that many. So tell us more about that. What set you on the path to hike all of those 14,000 foot plus peaks?
It was kind of initiated because of my MS diagnosis. So when I was first diagnosed, I was told that there was a 50% chance that I'd be living in a wheelchair within 10 years. And MS is known as a disease that can kind of rob people of their movement. And initially, I was so scared, I kind of stopped doing everything. Like I remember going to the gym early on and kind of getting overheated at the gym and my hands went numb and that freaked me out. And so I'm like, okay, well, maybe I'm just going to not work out at all. I'm going to stay at home. And thankfully, I had some great friends that reached out and kind of helped me explore different options for kind of staying active. And a friend reached out and said, hey, do you want to go hiking? Do you want to hike a 14er? I had no idea what a 14er was at that point in time. And I lived in Colorado for quite some time. But I had always enjoyed hiking as a kid. And, I hadn't really done a whole lot over in those recent years. But I set out with my friend to go up a 14er. And it was kind of a breakthrough moment for me because I had just, had created these own perceptions in my mind of what my life was, my long-term life is going to look like living with MS. And that kind of helped flip that upside down. And I realized, that it doesn't mean that I'm limited today. And there's a lot of different things that I can consider as I move forward to, kind of manage whatever, mobility or disability limitations that I come across. But there's still, monumental or mountainous things, that I can achieve. And that really kind of set me rolling down the path. Like I made it to the top of that first mountain. It was pretty incredible. And I think, probably within a month, I was going up the next one.
And what is the biggest challenge that you face with accessibility, both just kind of in your day-to-day life, but also when you are getting ready to climb a mountain?
Yeah. So I think what's been interesting for me over the last, as I've kind of gone through my experiences over the last 14 years with MS is I personally, and wrongly, I always kind of thought in my head that, disability is a physical thing. I think as humans, we try to, sort of like we try to connect what we see to what we understand.
Mm-hmm.
And what, the challenge that I've run into or that's been interesting with MS is so many symptoms are invisible. If I'm losing feeling in my feet or if I'm extremely fatigued and I need to lie down and take a nap within 10 minutes before I just pass out, others around me don't understand or don't see those things happening. And I've found that really that it's helped me a lot to communicate that, just assuming, most people aren't going to understand unless I say something. I think that's been a big learning for me. And I think that that's still an area where there's potentially a lot of, improvement in the world, especially from an accessibility standpoint, because I think that, again, it kind of a lot of times everyone's kind of coming at it more from, what do they see and what can they fix and not really thinking about what some of those invisible disabilities might be. I've encountered that a bit in the workplace, and I was concerned at first about kind of asking for some accommodation related, from a fatigue standpoint. I recall having, I woke up one morning, I was working and it was 10 a.m. and I just could not keep my eyes open. And that was one of the days that it really just hit me. I'm I need to figure out how I can deal with this and keep working the job that I really love. And at work ended up, actually, I reached out to the ADA at that point in time, and then ultimately reached out to our HR department with my employer to talk through options from a more flexible work environment. Which, fast forward to 2020, that I would say has certainly been, to some extent, the silver lining of the pandemic is a lot more flexible work. I think that's actually made it even easier over the last couple of years for me to kind of have that increased flexibility and, feel confident that I can step away during the day when I need to and not be concerned about what are people at my job thinking, are they wondering why I'm not responding in the middle of the day? So it's actually been somewhat refreshing to see that evolve over the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's great that you've been able to leverage that and maintain your employment. I'm still just curious about what are the things that you have to do when climbing a mountain, to sort of accommodate yourself with your MS? Do you have to plan for more breaks or, what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I look at it kind of from several days before to several days after, and then what I need to think about during the hike. Sleep is very important to me. So making sure that I'm going into a specific mountain hike, being very well rested. I guess it's to the extent that I can be, knowing that a lot of times I'm getting up at 2 or 3 in the morning to get a very early start, but certainly kind of the week leading up, trying to make sure that I'm getting as much sleep as possible so that I am confident in my energy level going into the hike. And then, and same on the flip side. So I've also learned, especially if I hike on a Sunday, for example, I'll typically take off of work on Monday to make sure that I have enough time to recharge and kind of gain that energy back so I can go back to work on Tuesday and, feel like I'm not kind of overwhelmed and fatigued. But then on the mountain itself, one of the great things I have found about hiking mountains is typically cooler up at 14,000 feet than it is down at ground level in Denver. And that has helped quite a bit with my heat sensitivity. And typically, I have had episodes on mountains where I've gotten overheated and I've lost feeling in my feet. And thankfully, the times that has happened, it's always been on the way back down, typically later in the afternoon. In the summertime, you're kind of out in the sun. I've found a few different ways to kind of manage. So I typically carry a lot of extra water. Not only to drink to help cool me down, but I'll also pour water over my head that kind of helps to bring my temperature down. And then mountain lakes and streams are fantastic. And so I've certainly had many a times where I have stopped and dunked my feet in the stream. Or sometimes, I can kind of tell that I'm starting to get overheated. So I try to kind of proactively respond. If I know I'm going to cross the stream and then we might not have access to water or something for the next couple of miles, I'll try to take advantage of that to, stop and soak my feet just to try to cool myself down before I kind of get to that point where I start to lose feeling. And then I've made sure, I have a very small group of friends that I've hiked with over the years. And so they all are aware of some of the challenges that I face and are really helpful with making sure that, I have those breaks that I need. Very rare occasion that I've run out of water, they'll share with me just to make sure that I'm able to kind of keep going and kind of minimize some of those symptoms from flaring up while I'm out on the mountain.
Do you have plans for more mountain climbing in the future, or are you sort of just like been there, done that, and on to the next challenge?
I am definitely going to hike some of the 14ers again. I know. In fact, I actually was hoping to go out here this weekend, but the weather's not looking the most favorable. But I have a lot of coworkers that are hiking some of the 14ers, so looking to go out with some of them. And it's a wonderful experience hiking in the mountains. And even if it's not a 14er, there are over, I think 500, 13,000 foot peaks in Colorado.
Yeah.
I'm not going to chase all of those down, I don't think, but I'm sure that I will hike some over time. But I've also started thinking about shifting a little bit to hiking to like mountain lakes and waterfalls, not necessarily always having to go to the top of the mountain. But that does also kind of flip-flop in that if I'm not going up as high, I also kind of run the risk of having more heat challenges. So I think there's going to be a little trial and error in my future of figuring out, if I go on some different hikes and not necessarily, that high of elevation gain, do I run into, more challenges that I might have to deal with.
Do you have a favorite 14er that you could share for all the Coloradans listening, or maybe one that you think is the toughest? Do you have any of those sort of ranking?
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to pick just one, but Wilson Peak is one of my favorites. And Coloradoan or not, Wilson Peak's claim to fame is being the mountain on the Coors Light can. So it's pretty well known. But to me, that one was a good mix of you start in the forest. It's a pretty kind of leisurely trail up to about, 13,000 feet. And then the last bit of climbing is a bit more technical, but it's not super long. So if you're kind of newer to the technical climbing, I wouldn't say it's the best entry level and kind of like what they would consider class 3 climbing, but it is a really nice mountain. I actually have a painting of it in my office because it's my favorite. And then I would say Capitol Peak is one of the most challenging. That one was, there were several mountains that I ended up hiring a guide to climb with. That was partially due to, some of my trusted hiking partners not being available to hike some of those mountains. And I wanted to make sure I was going with somebody that I trusted and that we were being very safe to the extent that we could. And Capitol Peak is known for some pretty drastic drop-offs and loose rock. And that was one of the third to last of all of the 14ers that I climbed. And I went with a guide on that one to make sure that I was as safe as possible and successful.
As a Colorado native, I hadn't even heard of either of those peaks. So, what advice would you give to someone who's living with a disability that wants to accomplish a big personal challenge like you have with hiking all the 14ers?
Yeah, so I would say go for it. That sounds so silly to some extent and almost like too easy, but it's typically the barriers that we create for ourselves that hold us back. And the more that I've hiked and kind of been around the mountain community and even kind of expanded my visibility into mountaineering across the world, there's been somebody who's blind that's made it to the top of Everest. And there's people living in wheelchairs that have made it to the top of 14ers. It's incredible the accomplishments that people are able to achieve. It's so easy to kind of make assumptions for ourselves of I have this or that thing that, kind of prevents me from doing something. And then you just kind of, decide for yourself it's not an option. And if there's anything that I've learned along the way, there are so many different routes to accomplish a goal. And oftentimes it's not the one that we think it's going to be. I mean, even in my 14er journey, and how I thought it was going to progress over time when I started is very different from where I finished. But I found a way, and there were certainly challenges along the way, but there's a whole network of people out there that are just willing to help, and don't create your own roadblocks.
That's great advice. So where would you like listeners to connect with you after today's episode, if people are interested in getting a hold of you, and what's kind of your call to action?
Sure. So I am on LinkedIn. I'm also on Facebook. I've had some people reach out to me on Facebook Messenger, and would love to hear from people. And I would say my message is stay active, find opportunities to be active. And, it may not be climbing mountains. It doesn't have to be, but especially in Colorado and the Mountain West region, there are so many beautiful places to see. And there is a fair amount of accessibility in a lot of the different national parks. Encourage everybody to get outside, enjoy the fresh air, and, find what you're passionate about and go out and do it.
And is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners today, or anything that we didn't ask that we should have?
I would say, so just since I've talked a little bit about the 14ers, I would also encourage anyone who's interested in getting into 14er hiking. There are a lot of great resources on the internet and social media for that as well. So 14ers.com was kind of my go-to along the way for getting all of the information, from routes to other people's kind of personal experiences and trip reports. There's an abundance of information out there. And again, that's just another area where the community is so supportive. And I know I've been inspired along the way by other people's stories that have gone up the 14ers, battling a lot of different challenges in life, whether a disability or a loss of a loved one. It's just really, it's a great group of people. It's such a great community. And it's so inspiring to see what others are overcoming and achieving, these lofty goals that they've set out for themselves.
That's great. We will share that website in the show notes. So thank you for that tip. All right. Well, thanks so much for being our guest today. This has been an excellent conversation, and certainly encourage our listeners to reach out to you if they want to follow up or learn more about your big milestone.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Emily Schumann, and Jessica Lucania is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant number 90DPAD0009-01-00. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.